Ladies and gentlemen, in 2009, the world was shaken by an unprecedented economic crisis, with banks crashing and government debts soaring all over the globe. We acknowledge then that a heavy price has to be paid for further damage to be avoided, and we implemented austerity. We cut budgets, we laid off workers, we reduced our public services. While the social effects of austerity are very much visible today, with very violent riots in Greece because of 20% unemployment rate, the projected economic crisis resolution isn't. We see how Greece's GDP is still shrinking at a 7% rate, while its sovereign debt is still rising. We see how austerity has failed us, and it's time to stop the payment. If the world has acknowledged, no thank you, that hurting people to such an extent as austerity does, is in such a dire situation, is a legitimate policy, we believe that hurting creditors' pocket is not only legitimate, but it's also efficient. Now, what exactly does sovereign debt default mean? Is the failure or refusal of the government of a sovereign state to pay back its debt in full. Postponing payment is also a form of default. Sovereign debt is the debt denominated in a currency that you cannot control, and we define legitimate as an economically efficient tactic in government's policy, and that we can afford the cost. Now, our model is to have a formal declaration of the government that it cannot pay its current debt, and if possible, negotiation with investors upon exactly the criteria and the requirements. Now, we believe that our burden today as the proposition is to prove to you that sovereign debt default is a legitimate and efficient policy in a significant number of cases when it comes to a massive debt that you cannot control. No, thank you. Now, I only have 2 points in my speech. First, I'm going to talk about the Robin Hood of finance. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the economy, a problem that keeps on solving itself. And my colleague's argument name is bond, the risk-free bond. Now, firstly, on the Robin Hood of finance. Because here I'm going to try to prove you the political legitimacy of that default. But firstly, onto the mechanism of how exactly we create that. Because we see how states are prone to have debt problems from time to time. We see how that is very hard to reduce, but can degenerate very quickly into a problem through interest rate increases. Now, what exactly is the problem? When you borrow an amount of money, in the moment when you reach the payment date of that amount of money, you will have to pay the amount that you borrow plus the interest rate that accumulates during the years of the borrowing. Now we see how you will have to borrow an extended amount. You will have to pay an extended amount when you reach payment date. But if you have a deficit, a budget deficit, you can't pay that extended amount. Therefore, you borrow further money. But if you borrow an extended amount, a much bigger amount than the initial one. So we see, furthermore, the interest rate for that amount will increase because of the fact that investors will notice that you have economic problems and will ask for higher interest rates in order to compensate for the risk. We see how, for instance, Italy's rates rose from 4% to 7%, almost doubling from August to October 2011, because investors noticed that Italy has to borrow further and further money, and that is exactly what we call that rollover. That is exactly the moment in which that becomes unsustainable, because you have to borrow further and further money. Now, in such a situation, you have mainly 2 possibilities. You either implement austerity measures, heavy austerity measures, or you default on your debt. Now, we believe that sovereign debt default is a much better alternative because it distributes the harms of the economic bubbles according to each participant's guilt. We see how we have three main actors causing an economic bubble. We have politicians, but I'm not going to tackle this because politicians get anyway, in the majority of the cases, they get kicked out of office. Either they implement austerity or if they default on their debt, in the majority of the cases, they are not there to actually pay the consequences. But the second actor are voters. And we see how voters lack the ability to prevent that, and furthermore, they don't have the factual information needed in order to actually comprehend a difficult economic problem. Yes, Miss?
The voters are aware of the fact that they are not paying taxes, that their government is in big debt. and that they need to do something in order to prevent the debt by electing a government that will help them, don't you think?
Well, I don't really see your point in this POI. What we are saying is the voters lack the ability to prevent that because they can't actually stop government from further borrowing in the moment in which a certain politician is still in office. Furthermore, they don't actually understand factual financial information in order to comprehend how all this system works, and the average Joe won't be able to prevent and comprehend this. Now, going on to the third actor, and these are financiers. We see how financiers directly cause the bubble and have both the knowledge and the obligation to be careful with their money. So we see how though everybody is somehow guilty, the guilt is not equal on all sides. And we believe that thus we need a differentiated treatment of these stakeholders. Now what sovereign debt default does is that it makes investors to be directly penalized for their recklessness. They lose the capital that they threw at inefficient governments. And on the other hand, voters don't suffer that much, and they only suffer indirect consequences. And we believe that this is according to the duty of the state, because the government has firstly a duty towards its citizens, and only afterwards it has a duty towards investors. No thing. And we see this happen in Iceland and Ireland. While Iceland decided to default on their debt, and they are now experiencing economic growth, Ireland decided to impose austerity measures, and their GDP is still shrinking. So we see how what austerity does is that it takes money away from people and gives to creditors, and it's in no way an efficient measure. Now going on to my last point about the economy, a problem that keeps on solving itself. Now we see how in a world without sovereign debt default, investors will not be discouraged by reckless lending because they are always assured by their government, because it's less risky to invest in a government bond than to invest your money in banks, because banks are much more volatile and the risk is bigger. Now we see how if they consider sovereign debt default as a real possibility, we will have two main advantages. Firstly, that financial companies will be prepared in case of a liquidity crisis. They will know that this might be a problem, therefore they will be able to retain some money in the bank. And secondly, we see that they will be able to respond quicker to negative information. Investors will lend less to countries such as Greece or ask for a higher interest rate if they see that countries might default on their debt and they have a problem. So because of the fact that sovereign debt default is an efficient economic policy, and because of the fact that it is legitimate and the burden is exactly, and it distributes the harms of the economic policy according to the guilt, we believe that it should be a legitimate economic policy.
It seems that team proposition in this debate fails to understand that efficient and legitimate are not the same thing, ladies and gentlemen. From the first speaker of team proposition, we heard an entire speech about how debt default is efficient, but we never heard and analyzed enough explanation of why it's legitimate. So I will help team proposition to understand that. Legitimate means it's justified, that it's okay to do so, it's okay to harm other people, it's okay to put our benefit in expense of debt. Efficient means that it will work. So we are not debating in this debate about whether it will work or not, we're debating whether it's justified and legitimate. And we would like team proposition to refer to that. And we would like team proposition to debate on whether it's legitimate or not. So, first of all, I'm going to refute what the other thing we heard from team proposition, and then I'm going to move on to our points. So let's begin. First, regarding the fact that they told us that austerity doesn't work, and the fact that they reduce public services, we have three answers to that. First of all, we don't think that austerity in general doesn't work. We think that they didn't try hard enough. That those countries didn't try hard enough. We have examples from countries that succeeded. Estonia, Latvia, Ireland succeeded in austerity, and we will spend that later on in our speech. Now, it's still not legitimate to have to have default. The fact that I did everything I can, no thank you, in order to earn money, but still I don't have the money, doesn't mean that it's legitimate for me to now go and rob a bank to have money, ladies and gentlemen. So this is still not legitimate, and I would like to hear an answer from Team Proposition in their next speech. To the third, and regarding the fact that they said that they reduced our public services, really? Because Greece in the last 5 years increased their public sector by 50%, which is the biggest growth in Europe ever. So we don't think that they actually did everything, that's the second, that they actually did everything they want in order to, in austerity, and we don't think that it means that it's still legitimate to have default. Yes?
Don't you think that your 5-year time frame is a little big, as it also includes the time before 2008 and the economic crisis?
Thank you. Yes, Greece had problems since 2001, and in 2004, remind you, Greece actually decided they're going to host the Olympic Games, which cost them tons and tons of money, and again, I'm going to refer to that later on in my speech. So they said that the citizens cannot prevent having a default, and that they care first of all for the citizen, and therefore they want to have a default. I have another again to answer for that. First of all, we don't think it's completely true. We think that citizens are the ones who don't pay taxes in Greece and in Spain and in Portugal, and we think that this is a democracy, which means citizens can pick the person that will, the government that will help them the most. And if they know that they have economic problems, they will pick the government that will help their economic problem. Second of all, even if the citizens couldn't do anything to avoid it, they are actually harming, getting hurt from the default, and I will elaborate on in my point. So if we want to prevent citizens getting hurt, we should prevent having a default, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. No, thank you. Regarding Ireland, I would like to know that Ireland is in the second place in economical growth in Europe nowadays. So before you're blaming Ireland for not preventing the default, they actually did that, and they're actually in a really good place right now. So please check your facts. And they said that people will invest less in those countries, that investors won't buy bonds. This will actually happen when we're having a default, but when we're having, they won't want to put more money in those countries, but also it will harm other countries later on that will want people to buy the bond. And again, I will elaborate on that in my point. So let's see what exactly are we talking about in this debate. We are talking about a principle, ladies and gentlemen, and we believe that if it's a legitimate economic strategy, we are not talking about our evidence of proof, not to show that it's never legitimate in any case to have a default. Because we also believe that if you're starving to death, then if your baby is starving to death, then it's okay for you to steal a piece of bread. If someone is breaking into your house, then it's okay for you to shoot him. But it's not making the fact of stealing and shooting people, no thank you, a legitimate strategy. Team proposition in this debate, no thank you. Team proposition in this debate must prove us that not that in some rare cases it might be legitimate, but as a principle it is legitimate. So let's move on to my first point, which is, no thank you, why it's not legitimate? Because it harms people. Let's see who that default harms. It harms foreign investors, countries, and especially private investors. It harms people from your own country that invested in your bonds, and it harms other states in the future that will go into difficulties, that would like someone, no thank you, to invest in their bond, and now those investors are skeptical, they are hesitating, and they would not like to so quickly to invest in your bond. So, in the Greek default was on the amount of 140 billion euros, which 90% of that was from private investors. So who are those private investors? No, thank you. Those are family with kids. Those are simple workers who put their who put their money, their pension money, their savings to college. No, thank you. Everything they had, and now they lost it because that country said that it doesn't care and it's defaulting. Though they had no, thank you. Though they had a choice. Now, how do we steal someone that takes money from other people and don't return them and by the harming them, we call it stealing. And we would like to hear the proposition if the stealing is justified. No, thank you. Now I'm going to move on to my second point, why it's illegitimate and therefore it's a choice. Because they have a choice. So if someone holds you at gunpoint and forces you to do something bad, we can accept that. But if you have choices, if you can prevent the doing something bad, even if it is feasible, then we think it's illegitimate to make the choice that will harm people. No, thank you. Now, what options did those countries have? Those countries neglected to collect revenues, and they took on expenditure, they didn't need. As we said, the Greek tax evasion was $30 billion euros, which is 1/3 of their bailout. The Spain tax evasion is 245 billion euros per year, according to Bloomberg. Now we can see, and if it's not enough, those countries, though they don't have money, decided they will host the Olympics, they will enlarge their private sector in 50%. We can see this is illegitimate. Another thing they could do is aggressive debt repayment. They could firstly repay their debt and only then take more money and only then invest in other things, exactly like Tunisia did and actually was able to avoid the crisis. The last thing is modernizing economy. So as we can see, those countries had a choice. They could choose not to. They could choose eliminate the tax evasion. They could choose to have a modernized economy. So this is because they didn't chose it because they decided they don't care and they are going to harm people. It's an illegitimate choice. Therefore, it's an illegitimate strategy. Thank you very much.
Applying the same policy again and again and again and expecting different returns isn't persistence. It's just madness, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen austerity fail in countries such as Greece, in which 28% of the whole working age population is now without a job. In countries such as Spain, in which half of the people under 35 years of age are without a job. And we see that these countries still have debt problems. Greece's debt is still increasing. We say that austerity is not viable in each and every situation, and therefore we need sovereign debt for other situations in which austerity is not viable. And we say that as a general rule of thumb, the larger the debt, the more we would rather default on it than force the population to pay for it through austerity. Now, in my own case, I'm going to have three major constructive points. Number one, the Robin Hood of finance, or how you punish each and every stakeholder for their for the guilt to which they contributed to the debt bubble. Number two, the economy, a problem that solves itself, or how the legitimizing sovereign debt is actually going to prevent bubbles. And three, the risk-free bond, or how less lending to states is a good thing. But first of all, a very concise rebuttal. Now they've told us of the harms of sovereign debt default. I mean, here we had a misportrayal of the actors that actually invest in bonds. Because they've told us that, oh my God, these families, these middle-class workers that also happen to have investment portfolios suffer. And like really, when's the last time your plumber had an investment portfolio or bought a bond? Right? These are not the guys who buy bonds directly. They may have money in banks, but this is a big difference. Legislation such as the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States and the Basel III in Europe forces banks to ring-fence investment from retail. This means that you isolate investment banking, who goes for the risky stuff such as very bad state debt or venture capital, from the middle-class families own private accounts. So you can't just use the private account of a plumber to pay for your investment banking's stupid decision to throw away money from Greek debt. And we've already dealt with this. Now, the second problem that they've told us, seriously, the second problem that, talk about sport. The second problem that they've pointed out is tax evasion. And we say that, yes, that might be a problem, though we kind of see it as an isolated problem from the sovereign debt versus austerity debate. And we say that even if it would be a failure, it's a politician's failure, and you should just, fine or jail these people according to the law, not impose austerity on them. Yes?
The fact of the matter is that this tax bill constituted a third of the bailout. If they cracked down properly, they wouldn't have needed it.
Yes, but they failed to do so. So what do you want to do? Like, you can't just force austerity on the people because the politicians are incompetent. And now moving on to my own argument, the Robin Hood of finance, which is a major response to this point. Namely, you can't force austerity on the people when politicians are incompetent. Because we've told you that austerity works best when debt is small. This is because austerity is a bitter pill with dire consequences. And economies can only take austerity in small amounts. Now, why is that? Oh, because austerity cuts jobs, salaries, and government spending, and uses that money to pay off debt. It takes away money from the economy, right? You don't pay your secretary if you're a minister. You take that money and you give it to investors. That means that the economy as a whole has less money to buy goods. There's less demand because you paid off debt and you don't have money to buy produce. And this means that there is less goods bought in the economy. Now this means that a lot of businesses have spare capacity, right? Especially when austerity has very, very huge cuts like in Greece. There's a lot of people who don't have their salary to spend anymore, so there's a lot of spare capacity. Now what happens when there's a lot of spare capacity and extra production? Workers are laid off. There's no real reason to keep workers if you can't even sell your products from the last month or the last 3 months. Now when these workers are laid off, not only does the economy suffer, such as Ireland's that, for instance, has a 0.7 decrease in its GDP year on an annual basis, and whose Prime Minister, Brian Cohen, was actually outed in 2011 because he didn't tackle the economy issue. We say that these workers who are laid off because of the spare capacity contribute to the problem, because once businesses start laying off workers, you have still less people with money to spend in the economy and more people who receive unemployment aid that you have to pay for, that exaggerates your deficit. The bigger the austerity, the bigger the cuts, the less people have money to spend, and the more the problem. So we see that austerity has dire consequences. And we see that even if voters are responsible to a certain degree, we're still holding them accountable through this idea of mistrust in governments, right? But it's the financiers, the people who risked their money, the people who had the decision to enter into this risk are the main culprits, and they should be the main people who are punished. Going on to the idea of economy and elastic demand. And we've told you that when you take sovereign debt default as illegitimate, like you're expecting it to happen, what happens is that investors respond to risky information much more quickly, right? They become afraid and panicked much more quickly when they see that a country has a deficit. So they slap Greece's hand before it can reach and grab the debt and actually inflate the economic bubble. And we're very, very fond of this cautionary effect, because it means that one sovereign debt actually prevents further sovereign debts. And this point is very intrinsically linked with my own argument. Namely, when investors lend less to governments, well, the economy as a whole goes better. Because that money can't just stand in the air. It's going to end up somewhere. And that somewhere is the private sector. And we say that we'd rather have these investments in the private sector because of two major things. Number one, because governments are inherently more inefficient because they lack competition. And number two, because not only is the private sector more efficient because of its competition, it also encourages freedom in the country. Because the private sector is the will of the people, right? The private sector, when it has more money, it means that it's easier for people to start businesses of their own, to see their dreams fulfilled, to take out a credit and start a restaurant or another business, right? Now, summing it all up, what I've told you is that austerity can't work in all the cases, and for the major majority of which that we have the sovereign debt default as a solution.
Team propositions in today's debate have still refused to talk about legitimacy. On and on, they're telling us that it works. And we will be dealing with that argument as well. But I would like to note very, very strongly that until they tell us why it is okay to effectively steal these people's money because their citizens were incompetent, they cannot win today's debate. Today I will be talking to you about my points, which are on the table, and they will be. First of all, why this, even if it's okay, even if default is okay at very certain times, it's not legitimate as a strategy. And second of all, about how sovereign debt default is different than any other kind of debt default. But before that, let me deal with a few points of refutation. So they told us that no one is really being harmed. The public sectors are being harmed. It's only these mega rich people. And to this we say two things. We say, first of all, why is it okay to harm mega rich people and steal their money? But second of all, we say that this is simply not true. No, thank you. Because when the bank doesn't get its money back and it cuts its funds, then people's pensions disappear. And when the head of a company, no thank you, loses his money and he has to cut workers, the people's pensions, the people's jobs disappear. This is just the way it works. No, thank you. So this idea that the people aren't getting hurt by this, the average Joe isn't getting hurt by this, is simply incorrect. And then, second of all, they told us that it's not the people's fault. I mean, they just evaded tax, you know? Like, why should that mean that we should impose austerity on them? Why? Because otherwise, the tax that they decided that they didn't feel like paying, that in Greece they decided they would make a game out of who could avoid more tax. Ladies and gentlemen, that money goes instead, no thank you, that money instead gets taken from other people's citizens and from the citizens of that same country. We explained to you that this is not legitimate. No thank you. We think that in a democratic country, it is the people's responsibility to notice that they're growing a deficit, because this doesn't happen over the course of 3 years. This is a long process in which they had many different ways to get out of, as in fact detailed to you in our first speech. And so it is their responsibility to notice that their deficit is growing and to vote in a government that will introduce all kinds of austerity measures, all kinds of ways of avoiding the need to default. We explained to you that this is the citizens' responsibility because that is what we believe in a democratic country. So when these people are evading tax and not paying the money, and when these people are deciding not to vote in the government because they don't want, no thank you, to have to raise their pensions, and instead they prefer to steal that money, no thank you, from investors, we say that then, yes, it's completely legitimate to pose austerity measures on these people. And lastly, they told us, once again, about efficiency. They told us, no thank you, that austerity measures don't work because it cuts people's jobs, etc., etc. And to this, we say three main things, I think. We say, first of all, this is simply not true. The fact of the matter is that in Ireland, once we cut 15% of the GDP in austerity, it became the second fastest growing economy in the EU. We say that Latvia cut 25% of their public sector and returned, and were able, therefore, to return half of the $7 billion that they had gotten in bailout. We say that this this works. And any of the examples they gave you about Greece or Spain, we say they haven't properly imposed austerity measures. We say that the fact of the matter is that Greece still hasn't cracked down on tax evasion. Once again, this was the third of their bailout. And so we say that until they've done this, they can't tell us that austerity measures don't work. But thirdly, and most importantly, no, thank you. And wait, that's only secondly. Secondly, we tell you that the fact of the matter is that even if it's efficient, even if it works amazingly and will solve all this country's problems, it's still not legitimate to do so by stealing. Once again, we tell you that if I decide that if America decides that it needs oil right now, it is not legitimate for it to go into another country and take their oil. We never had a response to this, yes.
But that's a very bad analogy because investors have actively decided to take the risk of Greek governments defaulting by giving them the money in the first place.
I will be expanding on this more in my second point. But basically, we say that what they were taking the risk of is natural disasters. What they were taking the risk of is special events, and more importantly, that in most cases there are other ways to deal with this. And once again, I'll be explaining this in my point. So, first of all, even if it's legitimate in some extreme cases, it's not legitimate. A strategy, by definition, is a long-term plan that was thought out before. We say we're not claiming that countries like Argentina decided 30 years ago that they're going to default on their debt. It's not some evil master plan. But what we do say is that these countries and their political leaders kept this in the back of their mind. We say that they chose not to take ways out that they could have used, all those ways out that Ifat told you. And instead, they decided that when they knew that eventually down the road they would have to default on their debt, and they decided that that would be okay, that they would use that instead. They kept this measure in their brain, and we say that this is what makes it a strategy, because they didn't get to a point where they had to. What happened was they knew while they were making these decisions not to cut the public sector and not to put in austerity measures that what they were going to do is eventually down the line default, and that we say is completely illegitimate. And that is why it's very different saying that this is a strategy and saying that this is an extreme case. But second of all, let me move on to my second point. And so why is sovereign debt default different than any other kind of default? No, thank you. Because we believe that some forms of debt default are legitimate. If debt default inside countries, for instance, of companies and people and things like that, we think that's important to the economy and a legitimate way of doing things. But there's a very big difference between this kind of debt default and sovereign debt default. And the difference is this: when in sovereign debt default, there is no overarching body that ensures that people actually do the right thing. So, for instance, when someone in non-sovereign debt default decides to give someone a risky debt, they take two measures to ensure that they don't lose that money. First of all, yes, they give it at a higher interest, and this also happens in countries, as we heard from Team Opposition. But secondly, and more importantly, they make sure that there is collateral. This means that no matter what, even if the person can't repay their debt, there is other form of income that they can take to ensure that they haven't lost all their money. So, for instance, the bank has decided to give a risky mortgage to someone, and in the end they can't pay it back. The bank can then seize their house and ensure that they haven't lost all the money. In fact, oftentimes they still manage to make a profit. So we say this cannot happen in countries. This kind of thing where you take people's collateral, because there is no collateral big enough for countries to give to their investors. And we say that this is what makes it different, and this is why, even though they've calculated the risk, because they don't have this collateral, we say that it's still completely legitimate, and this is what answers that point. And so, ladies and gentlemen, to sum up, while we believe that austerity is efficient, we say that even if it's not efficient, even if it doesn't work, it is not okay to instead decide to steal people's money. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to thank the second opposition speaker for her speech. Call the third opposition speaker.
The moment you're in a hole, you have to get out. And regardless of how you get out, you'll still get dirty. But the question is, how will you prevent most dirt getting on your hands? And for me to sum up why exactly team government obviously won this debate, I'm going to have two major points. First of all, I'm talking about Robin Hood's legitimacy. Second of all, about future prevention and restoration. Now let's talk about Robin Hood's legitimacy. Because he had a lot of arguments about how it is kind of illegitimate to steal, as it is illegitimate to murder. And this kind of very tristic arguments that don't actually fit to this. Because yes, it is illegitimate to make so much debt as Greece or Portugal or Spain have done. It's illegitimate, it's wrong, politicians should be punished. It's very, very bad that we don't punish them enough for this kind of thing. But you cannot, but the issue is, the moment you get to that point, the moment you get in the hole, what is it legitimate for you to do? It is obvious that someone will get hurt. Everybody is on the verge of getting hurt. The situation is dire already. The issue is, how do you distribute the harm in the most reasonable and equal way? And this is where our analysis has been a lot more explained and a lot more sophisticated than theirs. Because they simply made this point about how, people should get hurt, financiers should not get hurt, it's people's fault, and that's all. And they didn't even explain how, even in their case about austerity, how people will not get hurt. On the other hand, we did. And how is that? Because first of all, we said that either of the cases, be it austerity or be it that default, both financiers and people will get hurt to a certain extent. But let's look at, first of all, to which extent should they get hurt. First of all, the people. And they told us that people do have a fault in this, because it's most of these countries were democracies. People should have ousted those politicians if they made bad economic decisions. It's the people's fault. But first of all, in situations like Greece, politicians have concealed this information even from the people themselves about how much debt Greece has, as they conceal this information from the European Union. Second of all, we say that most people don't have enough economic knowledge to understand these kind of implications. And politicians simply do this thing because do this kind of reckless spending, know that the effects will not come in 1 year or two. They'll come when they'll be long, long gone from office. It's the kind of thing that politicians do, and people can very hardly prevent them. It's really not that much their fault. On the other hand, banks and investors are trained people that know exactly what they're putting themselves into. They know that these kind of things are extremely risky. But guess what they do? They know that at the end of the day, chances are that that country, like Ireland, for example, will simply implement some very harsh austerity and will give them all their money back, regardless of anything, so they still go on to it. So then, let's look at the two situations and which situation does it come closer to how much harm these two actors should be inflicted. First of all, in the case of austerity. In the case of austerity, it's more than obvious that people are hurt. And they're not hurt a little bit. They're hurt a lot. People are having their pay cuts, they're being fired, the whole economy is shrinking, which causes even more people to be fired, which causes even more companies to go bankrupt, which causes even less companies to pay taxes to the state, which causes the state to implement even harsher austerity to reduce its debt, which means that people will have even more pay cut and will be fired even more. This is the kind of snowball effect and deflationary spiral that austerity comes with. It has a harsh price, as we've seen in Greece, in which unemployment is bigger than 45%. On the other hand, in most cases, banks don't receive much damage in the case of austerity. But what happens in the case of debt default? First of all, related to banks. We say that banks have a way of preventing damage from coming to people. And they completely ignore the analysis about how banks can simply isolate investment banking from retail banking. It's very easy, because banks if they have enough money in the bank, as it is with the Basel III agreement, in which they have to keep reserves of more than 15%, they can prevent because they can prevent most damage from actually being inflicted upon people's pockets. On the other hand, what they do is that we don't get in the situation in which David Falls runs away with $90 billion in Cayman Islands after this money was paid to him after austerity. So banks do get a hit, but they don't get that big of a hit, and they are punished properly. And also people do get a smaller hit, because obviously the trust in that specific country is a bit lower, but we see that it is legitimate. Both parties are a little bit guilty. Obviously, financiers are a lot more guilty, and both parties are harmed. We say that is true legitimacy. True legitimacy. Yes, ma'am.
How are the people less guilty when they knew they had a way out, when they should have voted in people that were going to win?
They didn't know that they're even in the hole. They didn't know that they need a way out, and they didn't know what they should do. And second of all, they couldn't control these things in any way. About future prevention and restoration. Because we also say that a more legitimate thing is the one that has better effects on the long term for all parties, that prevents harm in the long run. And first of all, we say that it will prevent future defaults, future illegitimate accumulations of debt. And how is that? Because now financiers, as I said earlier, they know the risk involved in governments starting the debt rollover. But they simply don't care now. They know that anyway, it is widely seen as it being illegitimate to default. This is why governments very rarely default. This is why they know that they'll anyway get their money back. This is why even in the harsher period, even when it is more than obvious that those governments it will be very hard for those governments to pay back those money, they still lend money to these governments. This is how we reach this point. On the other hand, when they know that there is a high chance of them not getting their money back, in that moment they'll properly lend money according to the risk. And this is the best way for us to prevent these kind of things. Because in the future, politicians will have the same incentives that they had to be populistic and to accumulate this debt. People will still not know enough financing to prevent these kind of situations. And this is why we have to let the market regulate this situation. Even more, we say that we're also preventing future damage by directing funds where they're needed. And not in the government's pockets, but in the pockets of private investors. Because the moment banks stop investing so much in government bonds, because now they invest according to the true risk, they will also have a lot of money to spare to invest. And guess where they will invest? In the next best thing, in the private sector. And the only way for us to actually have for our economies to truly recover is if we have investments where they're profitable in the private sector, where we can actually have true growth, not based on the whims of some politicians, but on actual true demand of the market.
Team proposition has never properly addressed the issue of legitimization. The only answer we ever heard to the fact that this is like stealing is the fact that they have known the risk and that they have taken it into calculation. We said to that a few things. First of all, we said to that is the approach that comes from private markets, from the case of people and case of organizations. And we had a whole point explaining the difference. In the case of people and organization, we have a tool called bankruptcy, called collateral, that allows for compensation for the damage that people done. But in the case of international politics and international economy between countries, we have no such figure, and the side proposition has never answered our point on how this explains the difference. But furthermore to that, we say to you that the chance calculated in these bonds and the chance of the risk depends on whether war will erupt, whether there will be a national disaster, whether sudden economical crisis will hit the entire world and completely impair their chances, no thank you, of paying this debt. What doesn't this risk calculate? The chance that the country will suddenly declare that it does not pay its debt anymore because it believes that this is the best way for itself. This is a risk that is not calculated in the bonds because it is not legitimate and not even logical to be calculated in such a thing. No, thank you. So, on to my three clashes. The harms of debt default, could debt default be avoided, and legitimization as a strategy. So, let's start from the harms of debt default. No, thank you. So we told you a few things and heard only one. What we told you? We told you that everyone that invested in this country is harmed. And who are those people? First of all, those foreign investors. Second of all, those are internal investors. And third of all, those are organizations. We only heard an answer to the big rich organizations, and the only answer we heard is that those rich people, they don't seriously get harmed. Which you say, first of all, we didn't get a proper answer to our second speaker's question as about why it is legitimate to harm even someone that can survive this harm. But second of all, we told you that people in your own country, no thank you, have your bonds, and you're hurting them, and there's no one to defend them, because other people's governments may pressure you for the money, but your citizens cannot do anything except re-elect another government, which, under your logic, will not be able to do anything except default. No thank you. So, they told us that banks have a way of avoiding this damage to people, but they do not understand exactly how banking works. All banks, whether high risk or low risk, have investments in other places, or there wouldn't be good banks and profitable banks. That's how banks work. They have investment in other places, they buy bonds, they invest. They invest in other markets. That's how banks play the game of economy in order to profit. Even if it's not a high-risk bank, it's still a low-risk bank. The risk is existent. And when the country declares default, it declares that all the bonds that the bank holds are gone. And what does that mean? That means that all the pensions of people all the pensions of people that depended on those bonds, no thank you, are now gone. And if the bank crushes down, everyone's pensions and everyone's economy and everyone's savings are gone. Those are people hit and not just big, bad organizations. Yes, okay.
Under current EU legislation, this is illegal, and it's legal in both the USA. You have to pay for investment loss from investment capital, not from people's bank accounts.
First of all, that's not completely true, and that's not how legislation works. But second of all, even if it is the way, still, there's nothing to defend the bank from crushing down. And if serious debt default is now in motion, and the bank now lost a lot of bonds, perhaps 20% of the bonds we own, suddenly, the bank cannot pay back its debt to the people. And what happens when the bank cannot pay its debt back to the people? The bank crushes down. In the same way, economic crises have occurred again and again. And this again hurts the people. And we never heard additional words of legitimization to this hurt. To my next point of clash. Could debt default be avoided? And here we clearly win this clash simply on slightly irresponsiveness of side proposition to what we say. We told you that first of all, it's the country's responsibility to get there in the first place, because they have avoided the situation on every single step on the way, by eliminating tax evasion, by modernizing their work ethics, by not outliving their means, as our first speaker's point explained. The only answer we heard is that the people of the country didn't know what their government did and had no power to stop it. To which you say two things. First of all, the not-to-know case is true only for Greece. Only Greece lied about the fact that it's in debt. All other countries, all other citizens could access the information about their country's debt. No, thank you. But second of all, even if that was true for all countries, we told you that as an essence of what a democratic country means, the citizens of it have a responsibility to what their government does. Specifically because the people are the sovereign, the people also hold the responsibility for what the country does. And the fact that the people are damaged because of their government actions is part of what democracy is about. And they should, there's a reason why they give their trust to the government they believe will harm them the least or benefit them the most. That's why they hold the responsibility in the end. So between clashes like that.
But isn't this like hugely inconsistent with your point about how we harm those middle class peoples who hold government bonds? Like they are held accountable to a certain extent, right?
Again? Okay, so you claim that this is an issue with our previous point about those middle class people harmed. We say yes, those people are harmed, and they could be harmed less by austerity measures, and they could have been harmed less. And first of all, this only talks about our own citizens that will have to face austerity measures because they have responsibility. But this does not talk about citizens of other countries and about the greater harm that will be done once they lose their bonds. So, third clash, legitimization as a strategy. This is a short clash, especially because there was no sufficient clash about it. Because we told you that this, in our second speaker's point, this is not legitimate as a strategy, as a plan, as a tool of escape that you have kept, that the country has kept in its mind for a long time, and knew that it could avoid austerity measures that would anger the people because default is an option. And we have not heard a response from side proposition to that point, and thus we win this clash too. So as we win all three clashes, we must declare that sovereign debt default is not legitimate, and certainly not legitimate as an economic strategy.
Very quickly, because my third speaker appears to be a little tired, I'll just have to deal with this very swiftly. What we explained is that these people that are getting harmed by the fact that these investments aren't being returned are the middle class and upper class of other countries, not just our countries, and they're clearly not to blame for the fact that these citizens decided not to impose austerity measures on themselves and instead take this money. But just getting that out of the way, I will today be dealing with two main points. I'll be first of all asking the question, who's to blame? And second of all, asking the question, who gets hurt more? And so, let us begin with the first and most important question. Who's to blame? We told you here on side opposition that the citizens are to blame. The citizens are to blame because no matter, the only way you get to these, to the point where you have to default on your debt is if you have large amounts of tax evasion, or if you are overspending, and if you've decided not to impose measures on yourself that limit your spending when you don't have that money. We explained to you time and time again that this is a very, very long process throughout which there are many different routes of escape that are legitimate and should be used, and that if a country and its citizens decided not to impose these measures on themselves, then it is their fault. What we heard from side proposition is that one, the citizens didn't know, and two, that the investors are really the ones who are to blame. So let's see. The citizens didn't know. And this we say is simply false. The citizens knew they were evading tax. The citizens, in most of these cases, knew that they were in deficit. The fact of the matter is that after Greece got its first bailout, and there was no doubt that it was damaged, the citizens still decided not to vote in a government that would impose austerity measures because it wasn't comfortable for them. And so we say, yes, the citizens are definitely to blame. But to the fact that it's the investors' fault, that they should have known, that they know this. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that what the investors take into account is either big, major things happening, or second of all, that the country will somehow make a mistake and somehow fail. That maybe their return will be delayed somewhat. Not that the countries will decide that they're just not giving it back. We say that given that the investors, just as we know, that there are many ways out, that even if you've gotten to this terrible point and you haven't stopped it earlier on, you can then impose austerity measures. This is what the investors took into account when they lent it at a high risk. They took into the account that their return would be delayed. They took into account that maybe they'd get back a little less than they had hoped. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, what they didn't take into account, and what they shouldn't have to take into account on any level, is the fact that these countries are going to decide just not to do what's not comfortable for them because they don't want to raise the pension, the age of pension, We say that that is not something that they took into account, and not something that they should have to take into account. So there's no doubt that of the two, the citizens who decided not to impose austerity measures are more to blame. And we say that this clash wins us the debate alone, because no matter whether or not it works, at the end of the day, this is an issue of legitimacy. But I'm going to be dealing with that anyway. So now let us move on to the second point of clash, and that is who gets hurt more. Because what we told you here on side opposition is that if you impose proper austerity measures, and even if once you've reached this point, then you will always bounce back. We gave you examples, and the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, any of these countries that have complied with the IMF's rulings and the IMF's guidelines have always come back. It takes a little time, and we're not denying that, but they actually come back surprisingly faster than you think. We told you that Ireland and Latvia and Estonia have done this, and that they've managed to return. And we say that the countries that they brought up simply just haven't complied with the guidelines, and of course, therefore, haven't managed. But and so the citizens aren't being harmed that much. But who is being harmed? We're saying that we told you that investors are being harmed. We told you that these the people that are in banks that crash, these are the people that are harmed. We told you that other countries that would then want to get money are going to be harmed. And this was never really answered from side of proposition. And so, ladies and gentlemen, because this debate is a question of balance, and because at the end of the day, it's very obvious who's to blame, it's very obvious who gets hurt more, it's very obvious what the course of action that is legitimate is, we beg you to oppose.
Austerity has created the ninja generation. People with no incomes, no jobs, and no assets. People who don't have any great war to fight with, have no Great Depression, yet still suffer enormously. Because they were born into societies that already had that. People that are, in most cases, very young, such as the people of Spain, that half of them that are under the age of 35 are unemployed and suffering for the debt that paid for services for their elders, for other people. These are people who don't have a job, and side opposition would say that they don't deserve a job because they didn't impeach the politician for the debt when they were the age of, I don't know, 30 or 12 or 17. These are the people that side opposition wants to hold accountable. The people who have least benefited from the debt, the people who had the least means to stop the economic bubble, the people who had the least knowledge about the economic bubble. And this is austerity. And if side opposition wants to consider austerity as a legitimate policy, we can't conceive how sovereign debt isn't, because it has less damage to the economy and to the people. So going on to what legitimacy really is. And here we had a very consistent stance down the line. We said that if everyone is guilty, and we've acknowledged that even voters have a certain amount of guilt, everybody should pay the damage in proportion to their guilt. And therefore we moved on down the line proving to you how voters are the least, or the people are the least guilty. First of all, because they have no direct leverage over politicians, right? They can't just veto the debt piling up, and side opposition has never ever responded to this. We've told you that they lack financial knowledge. They can't predict, such as in the example of Italy that we've stated from the first affirmative, that was not even mentioned by side opposition. They can't predict that interest rates are going to rise from 4 to 7%, effectively doubling in a couple of months. They're not equipped with all this. And we've also told you how austerity harms them the most. We've told you about the deflationary spiral. We've told you about the huge unemployment in Greece and in Spain. And we've told you that investors get away without suffering any kind of harm because of the bailouts. They've never responded to this point, that financiers, banks, investors don't incur any kind of harm, yet they've never demonstrated that banks aren't guilty. And we say that they clearly are. But even more so, we say that they conceded to the fact they've conceded to the fact that sovereign debt default is legitimate when they're talking that you have to punish everybody to the certain extent, because by their own logic, when they talk about, oh, the harms that we give to the people when banks default, think about when their arguments about the middle class who lose their bank accounts, they're on our side, right? They're telling us that these voters shouldn't suffer because politicians actually created the bailout, right? These are the same kind of people. You can't just